Well, welcome back everyone to the myCOW podcast, the podcast that pulls together complex science and ideas from the New Zealand dairy industry to provide practical solutions and ideas that you can use on farm to drive cow performance and farmer business productivity. My name's Shaun Balemi. I'm a dairy nutritionist and I've been working with New Zealand farmers for over 25 years now. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about cow condition and how important it is to build a bit of condition in late lactation so that we're not putting on too much weight over that dry period. We're going to look at visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat and how that flows through into liver performance and ultimately cow performance in early lactation. But before we do that, I want you to please jump onto the myCOW website. Do me a favor, sign up for the newsletter that we have there. That allows us to keep in contact with you around any new podcast episodes that are being released. I'm going to summarize a bit of this content into written email form as well. And it also allows us to communicate with you around what we're doing with the myCOW app. The whole myCOW business is actually built around the app. So what we're doing there is we're pulling together milk, cow data, and various bits of farm data using AI and displaying it in a way where farmers can use that data more effectively together to make more efficient decisions on farms. So through the newsletter, we'll keep you updated as to any opportunities that you have to jump onto the piloting phase of that app, especially as we are moving forward into our commercial phase this coming season. So jump onto the website mycow.nz and sign up for that newsletter so that we can keep in touch and then we can push forward together from there. So as always, the content that comes through in the podcast is for information only, so it's not designed to be specific to your farm or specific advice. I'm trying to say that twice in a row. So basically what we're trying to do is deliver you information and content that you can then think about, do more research on, and talk to your real professional about how it practically and specifically applies to your farm. So what we want to talk about today is firstly why it's important to build condition in late lactation, or start to build condition in late lactation. So there's sort of three key areas here that are targets that we really want to hit. So we want to minimize the amount of condition that our cows lose once they calve. So if we look after cow condition early and we manipulate the dynamics of condition, which we're going to talk about more as we go on, that's going to lead to less condition loss post-calving. And the less condition we lose post-calving, the lower the amount of condition we have to put back on those cows, which is always going to be a positive. Secondly, we were going to talk about animal health and how the type of condition or the type of fat that we are building in our cows has a direct impact on animal health, particularly metritis, endometritis, ketosis, and a whole lot of immune system related issues as well. And thirdly, we're going to look at how all that flows into better milk production and also reproductive performance in the cows as well. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper and look at the balance of condition, so how much subcutaneous versus visceral fat we have in the cows, how that flows through into inflammation, and also how quickly fat is mobilized in the cow. And then we're going to talk a little bit about stored protein and how important protein is to fat utilization in the cow and also to overall cow performance in early lactation. And then we're going to finish off by talking a little bit about liver capacity and how the capacity of the liver is really important to overall cow performance, particularly peak milk performance and also reproduction. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some tricks and tips for efficient cow condition gain in late lactation. So we want to do regular condition scoring, particularly early condition scoring, so we know where we start. So around that sort of March, April, May, then we'll do some scoring just before dry so we know what we've achieved. Be sure that we're drying off our cows around that 4.7 to 4.9 body condition score. So actually pretty close to where you want them calving, or the condition score that you want them calving at. So probably within half a condition score at the absolute minimum. Ideally probably within a quarter of a condition score of the target. How we can adjust milking frequency, so using once a day milking with certain groups to try and not just get condition gain on the cows, but also have consistent condition across the herd. Managing feed carefully, so not pushing starch too hard or sugars, but getting the right amount of volume and fibre into those cows is really important for getting the right type of fat built in the cows. Monitoring the milk so that we know how well balanced we have that diet. And then making sure that we're not putting any more than half a condition score on our cows through that dry period. is really important to making sure that we're getting the right amount of good fat and not too much bad fat in those cows. So there's a good number of references that sit in behind this content. A lot of it is overseas data, but there is a little bit of a mix. There's a bit of work there from John Roach and a few others. So yeah, feel free if you want any of these references, make contact with me. Happy to send any of them through to you. But yeah, there's a bit of a list there if you're someone who likes to dig a bit deeper and do a bit more specific reading. So I'm going to take a bit of a backwards step here and talk a little bit about cow condition and the dynamics around what's happening metabolically in the cow. So this is a picture of the rumen. Obviously the rumen's a lot bigger in the cow. Now, if you're listening to this, if you do want visuals, there is some visuals under Spotify and on YouTube as well. So you can feel free to jump onto that. So the rumen here is basically taking feed into the cow. So we're going to keep it pretty simple. So that feed is being digested by the rumen microbes into feed metabolites. Now those feed metabolites are volatile fatty acids, amino acids and protein and a whole lot of different bits and pieces. Those metabolites are then shooting through into the liver. Now the liver basically has to take those metabolites and turn them into nutrients that the cow can then use. So there's enzymes and a whole lot of processes that the liver hepatocytes go through to reprocess those feed metabolites. So from there, those nutrients, they go to cow maintenance. They also go to cow reproductive performance. And then thirdly, they go through to milk production. And so when we're trying to build cow condition, we're trying to feed the cow or have more nutrient available to the cow than what she needs for maintenance, reproduction, and milk production. And so basically when we are supplying more nutrient that the cow needs for those three areas, then the cow can store that nutrient as fat and also as protein. So that fat goes to various places throughout the cow, whereas the protein goes into muscle. So I'll talk more about those different areas and how those dynamics play into what's happening in the cow. So there's three main areas that this nutrient is stored in the cow. So the first area for fat is subcutaneous fat. So this is fat that gathers under the skin or on the surface areas of the cow. The second area is visceral fat. So visceral fat is essentially internal fat. So it's fat that gathers around the reproductive organ, the liver, the heart, and various other internal areas of the cow. And the last area is in the muscle. Muscle is the main storage area for protein. So let's drill a little bit deeper on each of these three areas. So the first one is subcutaneous fat. So this is often known as slow on and slow off fat. So it's a little bit more dense than visceral fat, but it takes longer to build subcutaneous fat. But the good thing about that is it seems to take longer to mobilize, so it is more efficient essentially. The good thing about subcutaneous fat is it produces less cytokines. So cytokines are inflammatory bodies that are quite toxic to the cow. I'm going to talk more about those as we go on. The good thing about subcutaneous fat is the fat gathers away from the organs. So if we do have the release of any cytokines from subcutaneous fat, it doesn't have a direct impact on the organs. Because of this, subcutaneous fat generally has a little bit less stress on the liver. Because subcutaneous fat is slow on, slow off, so it's mobilized slower, it doesn't tend to overload the liver as much as what other types of fat does. And so overall, it is a much better fat storage to have in the cow. Now the second type is our visceral fat. Now, visceral fat is generally seen as the baddie. It is definitely not as good a fat in terms of animal health and animal performance as what subcutaneous fat is. So visceral fat is often known as fast on, fast off. And so if you're feeding a high sugar, high starch diet, that often favors visceral fat and it builds in the cow very quickly. Now, the tricky thing about visceral fat is it's internal, and so it is very hard to see in the cow, whereas subcutaneous fat is a lot easier to see. You can see it on the back and around the base of the tail and also around the ribs as well. So visceral fat produces more cytokines. So because it's built fast and it comes off fast, it tends to hold a higher level of cytokines or inflammatory bodies. And like I said before, this visceral fat is located around the organs. Visceral fat tends to cause more stress on the liver when it's mobilized because of these cytokines that it releases, but also because it mobilizes very quickly. It tends to want to overload the liver with fatty acids and making it harder for those hepatocytes to efficiently convert that fat into energy. Overall, not as good a fat for animal performance or animal health in that early lactation period. The third one is muscle fat and also muscle protein. Really, really important. I can't stress how important stored protein is in the cow. And we're going to talk more about this in future podcasts as we go into transition and towards early lactation performance as well. Muscle doesn't store a massive amount of fat, but it is the key storage area for protein. It is very efficient. It's efficiently built and efficiently mobilized, although there isn't a huge amount of research done on protein storage metabolism. It is growing, which is really cool, and there's some great new research that has come out just in the last 12 months. I'm looking at scanning and looking at how protein storage metabolism relates directly to cow performance. We're not going to dig too deep on that today, but there is some great work coming through in that area. Stored protein is the key source of amino acids, and amino acids are very important for liver metabolism of glucose. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later in the podcast, but just keep that in the back of your mind. So having good muscle storage is really important for liver performance, and it's really important for efficient fat mobilization or turning fat into energy. So now that I've gone through all of that, what does ideal actually look like? So firstly, ideal is adequate and even cow condition. Now, this is tricky because, as I said, subcutaneous you can see on the outside of the cow, visceral fat is on the inside of the cow, so it is a little bit harder to measure, but technology is coming. However, we can measure it by cow performance, and so I'm going to talk more about that as we go. But if we aim to dry off our cows at that sort of 4.7 to 4.9 body condition score, so we're not having to put any more than about a quarter of a body condition score on the cows over the dry period, then that's going to sit us around that 4.7 to 2 body condition score at calving, which is ideal. So we don't want our cows too light at calving, and we don't want our cows over conditioned at calving as well. Alongside of that, as I've already talked about, is we want ideally more subcutaneous fat because that's more efficient and more efficiently utilized and produces less animal health issues at calving. And we want to have less visceral fat internally in the cow that is going to create more inflammation, more animal health issues, knock the immune system around, and it's going to come off the cow quicker, which is not ideal. And lastly, we want adequate protein stores. So making sure that we're getting a good level of protein built in the cow is going to help drive the efficient use of fat that's mobilized in early lactation, and it's also going to help drive appetite post-calving and get those cows up to peak milk quicker, and also drive liver function, which is really important for hormone production, which flows on into reproductive performance as well. So now I've sold you the dream around what ideal looks like, other mechanisms around building cow condition in late lactation. So the first mechanism for reducing cow condition loss post-calving is all around appetite. Now, this is something I focus really heavily on, because if you have really good appetite in your cows pre and immediately post-calving, everything else tends to want to fall into place. So it is a really, really good metric, and I will be doing some more specific podcasts on appetite and what we look for in the paddock, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how appetite relates to condition loss in our cows. So the tricky thing with condition loss is it tends to start a negative energy loop. So if the cows calve and they haven't transitioned particularly well, or they're not very happy, so things are a bit out of balance, they need to mobilize a reasonable amount of condition to try and basically keep things in a level playing field, because they're starting to produce colostrum in milk, and they are producing a lot more than, or they require more nutrient than what they can satisfy with from the diet. So they have to mobilize a certain amount of cow condition. But the faster we can get those cows up and running and eating, basically getting that nutrient coming into the cow via the feed rather than from stored fat, then the quicker we get those cows out of negative energy balance and back up and running. And appetite is a really, really key harder there. Now, the tricky thing with fat mobilization is if it takes off and goes too fast too quickly, it tends to overwhelm the liver. And so it overwhelms the liver with fat itself, so fat that hasn't been properly degraded and properly utilized by the liver. But we also get toxins build up. So these cytokines that are causing inflammation throughout the body, they start building up in the liver and they actually start damaging liver hepatocytes. So what happens there is when that liver becomes saturated with fat, so we get this fatty liver effect, basically the activity of the liver starts to drop. The glucose that the liver produces drops with it. And so glucose drives milk production, it drives the release of glucocorticoids, and those glucocorticoids actually stimulate appetite in the cow. So if we drop the amount of glucose because the liver is overwhelmed with fat, it's impaired via inflammation or toxin build, then that has a direct impact on appetite. Now, the cool thing with appetite is we can measure it manually in the paddock. We can look at the left side of the cow, the golden triangle. It tells us how full the rumen is. We can look at cow behavior. So our sensor technology can be really useful with looking at appetite in our cow's early lactation. And obviously we can look at post-graze residuals and different things as well to ascertain where our appetite is at. Now, the next cab off the rank around reducing post-calving condition loss is insulin resistance. Now, insulin is a really important hormone because it is the key mechanism for directing nutrient into rebuilding cow condition. So when we say negative energy balance, what we're saying is that the cow's requirement for energy is higher than the amount of nutrient that she is eating to satisfy that need for energy. That means that she has to mobilize fat, which then goes into energy and makes up the difference. Once we get our cows into positive energy balance, that means that they're eating or consuming enough quality feed and releasing nutrient from that feed to satisfy her requirements. So once we get our cows into positive energy balance, then insulin can redirect some of that nutrient into rebuilding condition that's lost and bringing everything back into balance. Now, the tricky thing is if the cows have gone into negative energy balance for too long and have mobilized quite a bit of condition, that actually has a direct impact on insulin sensitivity and drives insulin resistance in the cow. And once that insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance starts to increase, actually makes it much harder to get those cows into positive energy balance. Even if we have really good quality feed, appetite stays low, and this is what starts putting the cows into a ketotic type cycle where the amount of ketone bodies that she's releasing from fat being mobilized at too high a rate starts to climb, and that upsets the whole apple cart. So the type of cow condition or the type of stored fat, visceral fat versus your subcutaneous fat, plays into insulin resistance via two pathways. The first pathway is the fact that visceral fat mobilizes a lot quicker, so it tends to increase the spike in non-esterified fatty acids or NEFAs that hit the liver, and that tends to actually drive insulin resistance because of the fact that that liver is being overwhelmed. Now, the second pathway is the inflammatory cytokine pathway. So as I said earlier, visceral fat mobilization creates or releases more cytokines into the cow, into the blood of the cow, than what subcutaneous fat does. So if we have put condition on our cows quicker and we've built more visceral fat and we don't have as much subcutaneous fat, we are going to have bigger spikes in non-esterified fatty acids hitting the liver, and we're going to release more inflammatory cytokines. And both of those factors drive insulin resistance, which is going to make it harder to get our cows back into positive energy balance, and she's more likely to lose more condition post-calving. The next mechanism directly relates back to insulin resistance, and that's liver capacity. So the liver has to have the capacity to take stored fat and convert it into energy that the cow can actually use, specifically glucose. Now, glucose is really important because it drives multiple cow functions, it drives milk production, and it also drives immune system function. Now, the tricky thing is as the cow is mobilizing fat and that fat is going through to the liver, that fat starts building up in the liver. Like the liver hepatocytes can only handle a certain amount of fat. But if we have a liver that's really healthy, a liver that's running efficiently, and a liver that's well supplied with protein and amino acids, then it actually has a greater capacity to handle that fat. And so a lot of what we do with the transition and also putting the right supplements into the cow, specifically methionine and betaine and other bits and pieces, in our high producing cows that are potentially a little bit over conditioned, we're trying to build the capacity of the liver to handle increased levels of fat coming into that cow, so that once that cow calves, she doesn't lose as much condition, and she gets up and running and hits peak milk as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, if we do have a high level of visceral fat in our cows and a lower level of subcutaneous fat, then that is going to increase the amount of rapidly mobilized fat in the cow. And unfortunately, because of liver capacity, the higher the level of fat that's flowing through the liver, the larger amount of ketone bodies that are going to be produced because of incomplete fat breakdown. Ketone bodies, they drive poor immune system function, and metabolic ketosis, which is going to flow on through to hypocalcemia and a whole lot of other energy and appetite related issues in the cow. Now, the last mechanism for minimizing condition loss post-calving is protein supply. Now, basically, amino acids are required for the conversion of fat into energy. If we're short of a metabolizable protein, then that will flow into a shortage of amino acids. Now, the cow can mobilize those amino acids and proteins from the muscle, but if we don't have a good level of stored protein in our cows, then she's going to fall short. So ensuring that we're giving a protein-rich diet in that late lactation period will make sure that we have a good level of stored protein going into our cows along with a good level of stored fat. So if the total diet is sitting around or greater than that 16% crude protein, that is a really good starting point in terms of getting good stored protein into our cows. Now, like I said earlier, there's not a lot of science or research done on this topic, so we are feeling our way. But I know when we give a adequate or rich protein diet in that late lactation period and through the dry and transition period, it helps to increase appetite and peak milk in that early lactation period. Now, it's worth noting that crude protein is actually an extrapolation of nitrogen in the total diet, and nitrogen is not true protein. So what we want is we want a good amount of metabolizable protein and amino acid supply. So we need to be careful that we are not just measuring crude protein and we get a really good level of crude protein going in, but there's a large portion of that crude protein that's actually non-protein nitrogen, which the room of microbes can turn into quality microbial protein, but there is a limit to what can actually be mobilized and delivered to the cow. So getting a good quality protein into our cows is really important. Again, the research is pretty thin, but making sure that our grass is not just full of non-protein nitrogen, it actually has a good level of peptides and amino acids available as well. Then alongside that, using quality protein supplements. Soy meal is a very good one, canola meal, and there are other protein sources that we can put into our cows as well to make sure that they're getting optimal protein nutrition. So it's worth noting that it's actually the easiest time of lactation to rebuild protein stores in late lactation. The reason for that is it's easy to get good quality protein into the cows. We have generally pretty good quality grass through that autumn period, and we can get really good quality supplements into the cows via in-shed feeding, mixer wagon, feed pads, that sort of thing. Once we hit the dry period, it can be a little bit more challenging to get really high quality protein into our cows. So getting good protein nutrition into our cows in that late lactation period and also the transition period can be really useful once we start calving, and we want to see those cows recovering and hitting peak milk as quickly as possible. So we're going to change gears now. We're going to start looking at how late lactation cow condition gain and the balance of visceral and subcutaneous fat impacts animal health. So I'm going to start with lameness. Now, lameness is a tricky one because you don't always associate cow condition loss or poor metabolic health with lameness. But when the cow is releasing or mobilizing a whole lot of fat, she's releasing these toxic cytokines, which cause inflammation in the cow. And that's not just inflammation around the reproductive organ or the liver, it actually causes inflammation in the hoof as well. If you have a high proportion of visceral fat in the cow that's been mobilized, you are going to get a bigger buildup of these inflammatory cytokines. Now, the second mechanism for lameness relates to negative energy balance. So as the cow gets trapped into a negative energy balance where she's mobilizing a lot of condition, that actually causes the cow to mobilize fat in the base of the hoof, known as the fat pad. Now, that fat pad is the cushion that sits between the pedal bone and the base of the hoof. It's kind of like on your jandal, the thickness of the sole. You know, if that jandal wears out, then you feel every stone and everything under your foot, because you don't have much of a pad or much of a sole. So if the cow is mobilizing a whole lot of condition and that fat pad reduces, then that cow is more susceptible to foot ulcers, stone bruising, and other lameness related issues. The next animal health issue we're going to attack is mastitis. Now, mastitis is linked to glucose supply and immune system function. So as I said before, if the liver is overwhelmed by the amount of fat that's been mobilized, and also the influence of increased cytokines or inflammation from more visceral fat being mobilized, that's going to impact the liver's ability to release glucose. And a drop in glucose is going to drop the immune system of the cow, and that's going to basically make her more susceptible to mastitis. There's also a bit of research that shows that if we have increased cytokines or inflammatory bodies circulating around the blood, that is also going to make it harder for the udder to recover from a mastitis challenge as well. Now, metritis and endometritis are diseases that have been focused on a lot in the New Zealand dairy industry alongside ketosis. And the reason for that is because of their effect on immune system function, but also reproduction. So with metritis and endometritis, if we are getting into if our cows are getting into a negative energy balance and they are mobilizing more visceral fat because they have less subcutaneous fat available, that again is going to cause the increase in toxins, cytokines, inflammatory bodies, and that's going to have an impact on the immune system. Now, where it becomes more specific for metritis and endometritis is if we have more visceral fat accumulated around the reproductive organ or the uterus itself. Now, what happens when visceral fat is mobilized that it is accumulated or has accumulated around the reproductive organ is it releases cytokines directly at the reproductive organ. And so the issue with that is that actually the mobilization of that visceral fat, now that site-specific inflammation makes it harder for the cow to get rid of her fetal membranes. So you're going to have more retained fetal membranes, and that is going to increase the amount of metritis and endometritis. Now that leads me on to ketosis. Now ketosis is a buildup of ketone bodies in the blood to a point where it shifts the metabolic function of the cow. Now that buildup of ketone bodies is driven by the incomplete breakdown of fat in the liver. So a liver that has low capacity or has been overwhelmed by fat, and so it's no longer converting that fat efficiently, and as a result is producing more of these ketotic byproducts. Sitting alongside the incomplete breakdown of fat by a liver that's been overwhelmed is the fact that higher visceral fat mobilization increases the amount of cytokines that are going into the liver. Now, these cytokines actually have a direct effect on the breakdown of fatty acids, producing a higher level of ketones. And so again, that feeds into that ketosis. Now, the third area is the supply of amino acids. So if we don't have enough protein coming into the liver, alongside the amount of fat coming in, the liver can't efficiently convert that fat into glucose. And so again, that produces a higher level of ketones. So all three of those areas all drive increased ketosis in the cow. So again, if you have a higher proportion of subcutaneous fat and a lower proportion of visceral fat alongside a really good protein supply into the liver, then your risk of ketosis drops dramatically. Now, hypercalcemia can be linked back to rapid condition loss or negative energy balance, metabolic ketosis, which actually upsets the metabolism and flow of calcium in the animal, and also inflammation. So ketosis and inflammation has a direct impact on calcium metabolism via the immune system. Now, the immune system uses a lot of calcium. Now, if the immune system is running hard because ketosis has increased and there's a larger amount of inflammation happening in the cow, this can upset the amount of calcium that's actually available for cow function and thus causing a metabolic disease in the cow. So now we're getting to the pointy end of the podcast. We're going to talk about reproduction and milk production. So the first area I want to talk about around reproduction is days to first cycle. So if cow condition is not in the right balance, we've put on too much condition too quickly, the ratio of visceral fat to subcutaneous fat is too high, that is basically going to have a direct impact on the days to first cycle. So the main mechanisms for this are poor recovery post-calving, poor appetite, which obviously plays into poor recovery, and also poor liver health. And that flows into a metabolic shift, which upsets estradiol and progesterone levels in the blood, because the liver is the key organ that stimulates the production of these hormones. But second to this are spikes in progesterone levels from the release or the mobilization of fat. And so this can upset ovulation, of oocyte or follicle development, and so on and so forth, which we'll talk more about soon. And then the third mechanism is the release of cytokines. Again, these cytokines are playing a lot into this podcast, but that inflammation actually directly upsets follicle growth, which then flows on to oocyte or egg quality. So if we have poor follicle growth and poor oocyte or egg quality, that basically means that fertilized egg is more likely to fail or abort in that early phase of pregnancy. And that leads me on to poor egg or oocyte quality. Negative energy balance is the main culprit here. So this causes a drop in LH or luteinizing hormone production. Alongside this, it actually reduces the ovary's sensitivity to LH as well. The second area that influences poor oocyte quality is glucose availability. Now, as I said earlier, with more visceral fat mobilization, more rapid fat mobilization, that drops liver capacity to produce glucose. And if that production of glucose drops, that has a direct impact on oocyte or egg quality, which then goes on to impact reproductive performance in the cow. And so that is all tied into the delivery of glucose and also insulin sensitivity and how that plays into insulin-like growth factor and also GnRH production. So it basically upsets the whole hormonal balance in the cow. And the third factor is if we have elevated ketone and non-esterified fatty acids, they are actually toxic to the oocyte or the egg. And so if we have an increased amount of ketone bodies and non-esterified fatty acids and also these cytokine or inflammatory factors, it also has a direct impact on the survivability or the quality of that oocyte and that egg that's going to then be fertilized and produce this coming year's calf. All right, now we've got into milk production, which is the last area. So there are two main areas I want to talk about around milk production. So the first one is poor feed conversion efficiency, and the second one is lower and slower peak milk. So with feed conversion efficiency, that is directly linked to liver capacity and also liver function and performance. So if we have cows that are losing too much condition too quickly and they're releasing or mobilizing a higher proportion of visceral fat, that is going to have a direct impact on the liver, which is then going to reduce the cow's ability to convert food into metabolite that can be used for milk production. So basically what that means is if we have really good feed conversion efficiency, that means that we are producing the maximum amount of milk that the cow can potentially produce per kilo of feed that we're putting into her. If we have really poor feed conversion efficiency, we might be shoveling in 20, 21, 22 kilos of dry matter in an early lactating cow, but she's only giving us 1.8, 1.9 milk solids, where her potential is actually to give us 2.4 to 2.6 kilos of milk solids per day. So there can be a big difference in terms of feed conversion efficiency between cows that are in different metabolic states in terms of whether they're doing really well, they're in positive energy balance, and they've got really strong appetite, or they're in negative energy balance, they are still mobilizing a lot of fat, and their appetite is really poor. So basically getting that balance right, maximizing liver capacity and liver health and performance through the early lactation period will help to maximize the amount of milk that our cows can produce per kilo of feed down their throat. So the factors that affect feed conversion efficiency relate pretty closely to a lower and slower peak milk. So again, I know I'm banging on about the same sort of material, but this helps you to identify what you need to focus on and look at closer on farm to drive increased performance and profitability. So essentially what we're trying to do to drive a earlier peak and a higher peak is we are trying to get those cows through that transition period, calved down and recovered as quickly as possible, lose as little condition as possible, which then flows into an appetite that is as high as possible. So we do that by feeding our cows really good quality feed, filling the rumen up nice and full so that we are driving rumen fill, rumen capacity, but also getting the maximum amount of microbial population, that rumen as well, that do all the hard work in releasing the metabolites from the feed. And so there is a lot of different factors that play into that, and I'm going to talk about this a lot over the next few months as we come into the coming season. But for today, basically the liver still sits as the centerpiece for driving a higher peak and an earlier peak. So if we can get cow condition in the right balance, and we're not losing too much condition at calving or just after calving, then we maximize how well our cows can peak milk and how quickly our cows can peak milk. And so essentially that comes back down to insulin sensitivity, it comes down to the flow of glucose, the efficiency of how well the liver is taking that feed metabolite and releasing it into nutrients the cow can use, and also our supply of protein and amino acids is very, very important for this whole process. So feed conversion efficiency, peak milk, and how quickly our cows peak milk are directly related to how we've managed the building of cow condition, how we've managed the transition period, and also how we're managing the diet in the early lactation period as well, because the supply of protein, the supply of amino acids, the supply of available energy, be it sugar, starch, and the balance of fiber, all play into the picture in terms of maximizing how well we get our cows up to peak and how quickly we can do it. All right, so is there an opportunity on your farm? So I'm going to go through some of the key questions that I think would be worth asking yourself around this topic. So are my cows displaying poor appetite post-calving? So is it really hard to get them up and running? Am I putting them on once a day for a couple of weeks because they are not recovering very quickly? My rumination is not coming up very fast. There's a whole host of things around appetite. Are my colostrum cows or my early lactation cows looking really hollow? There's a whole lot of things to think about around appetite post-calving. But if appetite is an issue, then not just having a look at what you're feeding, but having a look at the transition and also what's happening in terms of cow condition. Are my cows over-conditioned at calving? Am I putting on a whole condition score over the dry period? What is the condition score at dry off? All these sort of things are really important to think about. What about rumen recovery? Are my cows not recovering very well post-calving? Are they sitting at sort of 420, 480 rumination minutes in their calving and they're crashing to say 250, and it's taking them 4 to 6 days before they get back up over 400 again? If that's the case, are the cows losing lots of condition associated with that? And could that be a cow condition issue? Am I putting on too much condition too quickly, like I said before, or am I drying off my cows too late? Are they taking a hit at the dry off period and losing condition after dry off? Yeah, there's a whole lot of different factors that come into that. Are you seeing high BOHB levels and NEFA levels in the blood indicating subclinical or even clinical ketosis? If that's the case, have a look at your cow condition building dynamics. Are you seeing metritis or endometritis? So are you treating far too many dirty cows post-calving? So again, we can link that back to rebuilding conditions through that autumn or late lactation period and making sure we get the balance of visceral and subcutaneous fat right. So do you suspect a liver that is not functioning particularly well, either fatty liver or just low liver capacity? So we can take blood tests to actually look at liver enzymes, so GGTs and ALTs and different liver enzymes to see how well the liver is actually performing. It often ties back into high BOHB and NEFA levels as well, but it is well worth looking at those liver function blood tests to see how well your cows are actually going through that early lactation period in particular. All right, so now that we've pulled apart the difference between visceral and subcutaneous fat and how that flows on into milk production, animal health, and condition loss post-calving, what can we actually do to help negate some of the negative effects of too much visceral fat or an imbalance in condition? So the first thing we can look at is timing. So the earlier we start to build condition, the more time we have to build that condition over a longer period. So we can basically try and maximize the amount of subcutaneous fat that's built in our cows by building that condition over a longer period. We're also more likely to have a higher protein storage level in the muscle as well if we build that condition over a longer period of time. So 1 kilo per day gain costs around 50 megajoules energy. So how we allocate the diet, which is what we're going to talk about soon, is really important. So we want to make sure that we're allocating enough to build that condition, but we don't want to build it too quickly. So we want to allocate enough feed so that we're in the right window around building that condition over the right period of time. So how does this look practically? Let's say your cows are doing about 1.8 kilos of milk solids per cow per day on the 15th of March. Now you need to feed those cows an extra 2 to 3 kilos of dry matter up until about the 15th of May. And that is going to give you a body condition score gain of around 0.75, so 3/4 of a condition score, or around 25 to 40 kilos of live weight, depending on obviously your breeder cow and what the live weight was on the 15th of March. Now, the next area that we can look at is milking frequency. So basically this is exactly, as I say, the amount of times you're milking the cow over a given period. So if we milk our cows less, then we can save energy on energy cost of walking. We can increase grazing time because those cows are in the paddock longer. And that is all going to contribute to more energy going to the cow that then can go on to build cow condition. So doing 3 and 2 or once a day can be really useful tools. And if you put a cow on once a day, especially if she's around that 1.6 to 1.7 kilos of milk solids in production, it's likely that she won't drop any, or she'll drop very little, if any, production going on to once a day. But the key thing with milking frequency is you've got to still feed your cows the same amount. So if you're allocating them 18 to 19 kilos of dry matter and they're producing about 1.65 kilos of milk solids, then you must keep that kilos of dry matter allocation at that same level. If you drop it by 2 kilos, then yeah, they might continue to milk, or they'll probably drop a little bit of milk production, but they're going to have less energy available to put into cow condition. So the idea with going to once a day is you maintain milk production at that 1.6 to 1.7, but you don't feed the cows any less, so that they have that extra 3, maybe 4 kilos of dry matter to start building cow condition. So alongside milking frequency and allocation is diet calculation. So we can do our kilos of dry matter calculation at, say, 17, 18, 19 kilos of dry matter, depending on the size of the cow and the milk production. But if it's not quality, we don't have the right amount of fiber to energy to protein ratio, then that's going to upset the whole apple cart. So we still have to do our calculations to make sure that everything is in the right window. Now, it's a little bit hard for me to go into specifics because different feeds have different dynamics in terms of rumen digestion, but getting a rumen nutritionist or someone involved who can help you do those diet calculations to make sure your ME, your metabolizable protein, your fiber level is all at the right level is really important to getting a really good consistent body condition growth, but also maintaining milk production Because like I said before, if that cow is dropping in milk or she's starting to dry herself off and you're still feeding her 17 to 19 kilos of dry matter, there's a big cost to getting that feed into that cow. And so you want to get the maximum amount of milk back by keeping her feed conversion efficiency up at an optimum level. So the first component of diet balance is energy. Now, I'm not going to go into specifics again, but I'm going to talk a little bit about energy and how it works, because it's important that we supply the right type of energy so that we're not underdoing the diet and we're not supplying enough grunt into the rumen. But also at the other end, we don't want to overdo it by putting a whole lot of wheat into the system. You're pushing a highly fermentable starch that overcharges the rumen, and that can cause issues as well. Try and get things in the right balance. So feed quality is really important. Feed quality alongside the correct fiber level, because we want to keep rumen flow rates within a pretty fine window. And I know this is all really complicated, but these are sort of things to think about. Sugar levels in the grass can vary a lot based on sunlight hours, especially in that late lactation period, particularly if you're spring calving. So yeah, keep an eye on sunlight hours. If the cows are starting to really drop off and they're lacking performance, and they look like they're lacking energy as well, and we're not getting good rumination, production is falling away, there could be a lack of sugar in the system. So getting enough sugar to make sure that the rumen has enough grunt is really important for getting good rumen metabolization, so good feed digestion, and that flows into good production, but also efficient body condition gain. Now, there's research that shows that if we feed a highly fermentable energy source, so, wheat, again, highly fermentable, some of those are like too much starch, too much soluble sugar, fodder beet and things, the cow is going to lean towards more visceral fat storage versus subcutaneous fat. So if we cool the diet down a little bit, so lean a little bit more on barley, maybe use a bit of a mixture of barley, palm kernel, maybe a little bit of DDG, but really good quality grass with it, then you get a really good balance of not too fast rumen flow rate and not too hot a diet, but still a good delivery of energy. And I know it's really hard to get that balance, but the biggest thing I'd look at is the manure. If the manure is a bit loose and a bit bubbly, you need to cool the diet down. You need more fiber. If the manure is reasonably firm, so if you're looking at the manure scoring system, which you can just Google, you want a score of roughly a 3 to 3.5 is ideally where you want to be, probably leaning more towards that 3.54, a little bit firmer manure. But that is basically meaning that the energy is not too hot, the rumen is happy and very stable, and it's going to be building a good amount of subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat. After energy balance, we want to look at protein. So getting quality protein into the cow is really, really important. So that helps obviously stimulate stored protein into the muscle, particularly if we're getting a really amino acid rich protein. So yeah, a protein that's high in metabolizable protein. Again, that protein is really important in the liver for producing glucose or energy. And so to get excess energy produced and to get that stored as fat in the cow, we need to supply really good quality protein with it. Key thing in autumn is sometimes we get that real autumn flush. So we actually get quite high milk urea levels, which generally is excess protein, but just be careful of how much non-protein nitrogen you have in the grass. And so if you get a herbage test, you can actually measure the amount of non-protein nitrogen. And if you get the right type of test, you can start looking at the amount of metabolizable protein as well. Again, this is getting down to a nutritionist type level. But if we supply really good quality protein, that really helps with the key building blocks to setting that cow up to do the very best she can in early lactation. Now, the tricky thing is there is a bit of a lack of research in this space. So yeah, like I say, watch this space. There will be more research coming through, and we can actually more accurately measure the amount of protein or the amount of muscle mass in our cows versus subcutaneous and visceral fat going forward, which would be super useful. The next area in balancing or managing the diet is looking at your mineral balance. So, mineral balance is something that gets looked at really closely in early lactation. But getting the right amount of calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and particularly sodium in that late lactation period can be really important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's important to be rebuilding the calcium and phosphorus mineralization in the bone so that there's plenty for the cow to draw on once she hits that early lactation period. Sodium is really important in autumn because it helps to balance high potassium in the grass. So when we're getting that autumn flush, milk ureas are getting really high. We often have really high potassium levels coming through. So if we have free choice salt out, salt in the water or salt in the feed, that can be particularly useful to ensure that we're getting good feed conversion efficiency and efficient energy metabolism in the cow. Trace minerals are also really important for condition gain. Chromium is particularly important. I talked a bit about insulin sensitivity earlier. So chromium is a really key mineral in ensuring that we're getting really good insulin action in the cow. So we're getting good insulin sensitivity, which helps partition energy into building condition over a longer period of time. Likewise, B12 and selenium are also very important for liver function, liver health, but also immune system function and keeping the stress levels low in those cows as they get to late lactation, and particularly when they go in and through the dry off phase, because that can be a particularly stressful time of the year. And also B12 is very important for energy metabolism in the liver. So important to get those optimum levels of B12 in there so that we can push energy metabolism and make sure that we're getting good condition gain in that late lactation period. Lastly is fibre, or NDF. Now, fibre is really important for rumen function. It's really important for the efficiency of digestion. You don't want too much fibre because high fibre levels can make the diet poorer quality, which means that microbes have to work a lot harder to release the nutrient from the feed. But getting that right balance is really critical. Firstly, we want enough fibre so that rumen flow rates are consistent, or they're correct. If the digester or the feed is flowing through the rumen too quickly, the rumen microbes don't have enough time to actually get into that feed and release all the nutrients. If rumen flow rate's too slow, then we're just not getting enough nutrient into the cow over a 24-hour period. So we want to get that sweet spot, and looking at the manure consistency, so looking at a score of around 3.5 if you're scoring your manure, is definitely the best way to look at fibre level and also rumen flow rates. Now, alongside manure scoring, we can look at our rumination as well. To be a little bit careful, as cow intakes drop, because we're getting in late lactation, we do see a bit of a drop in rumination just because of sheer volume. The rumen is not having to work as hard, but we do want stable rumination is really important. So we don't want to see it go up and down all over the show. So look at your manure for consistency and look at your rumination minutes to just to make sure that that rumen is in a good, healthy, stable space. All right, we're coming to the end of the podcast now. I'm going to finish off with body condition scoring. Now, I'm not going to talk in too much detail around this, but other than to say it's really important to know constantly where your cow condition is right throughout the herd. So you want to know what the average is over the different groups, particularly the different age groups. So sometimes your first and second lactation cows are suffering a little bit. Sometimes your older cows are suffering a little bit. Sometimes your high producing cows are suffering a little bit. So it's just figuring out who's who and where. You're individually feeding the skinnier cows a bit more, or the fatter cows, you're pulling them back a little bit. And also working your groups as well. You don't want to be changing cows from one group to the next too often, but in late lactation is actually a really good time to set your groups up. So you want to set your groups up for cow condition in that late lactation period so that you're getting good consistency in terms of cow condition across the herd. And then after dry off, you want to set those groups up for calving, and you want to keep them in their groups until they calve, because any change in a cow from one group to the other causes a considerable amount of stress, and we want to try and avoid stress in our cows at all costs, because any bit of stress is always going to cost production and reproduction and overall cow performance. So with scoring, we want to score nice and early so we know what's happening in our cows once we get probably just as we start hitting that autumn period, so around that March-April period, and then work on our condition over the next sort of 6 to 8 weeks until we hit dry off, and then away we go. So those that are drying off a little bit earlier, say the second week of May, they might want to start attacking, putting their groups together and figuring out where they're at in late February. Those that are drying off first week of June, for instance, then they might be okay to start around that first or second week of March. So if you do the hard work at the start, know your cow condition, try and get as good a consistency, so as tight a range of cow condition over the whole herd, at dry off, and then try and hit that 4.7 to 4.9 at dry off, so that you're only putting on around 1/4 of a condition score over the winter. It's a nice little buffer. Now, some farmers try and dry off at calving condition, and that's okay as long as you keep a really close eye on the cows over winter. If we have a kind winter and they go and put on another half a condition score, then that can be problematic as well. So just sort of knowing what feed you have available, what the risks are in terms of, are they going to potentially put on more condition, or are they potentially going to suffer through the winter? So we want to make sure they're in really good condition to dry off. Just being aware of all those different factors and working around that, because at the end of the day, if the closer we get our cows to the target at calving, and the more subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat we have at that calving period, the better we do transition, then it's going to flow through into better appetite, better cow recovery, less days to first cycle, better repro, and well, better overall feed conversion efficiency, which is a massive driver of profitability, and then also earlier and higher peak milk as well. So there's a lot to gain by getting these cows into the right window and working on cow condition in that late lactation period. Well, thanks heaps for jumping on the podcast. It's great to have you with us. And yeah, I hope you found this helpful. Again, please jump on the website, myCOW.nz, and click on the subscribe to the newsletter button so that we can keep in touch with you, let you know when there's new podcasts, different bits of content coming out. And we can also keep in touch with you around what we're doing with the myCOW app, which has been a real passion project for me for the last couple of years. So really excited to start introducing everyone to what we're doing in that space. So yeah, so watch out for the next couple of few podcasts, because I'm going to start talking about where we're heading and what's happening. And that will come through into socials as well. So thanks again for jumping on. Awesome to have you with us. And yeah, look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.